All right, so we'll get started today, guys. So week 10, you've made it essentially. This is a reflection and we'll talk about applying the changes to the future. So we'll go through the various weeks today. We'll have kind of like a slide or two on each week, understanding what it means to have ADHD. So we'll go through some of the things we talked about in the first week, commanding your attention. So specific things like the Pomodoro technique and stuff like that we can use to improve that to some degree. To what and how much to commit. So this relates to the goal setting week that comes after that. And it's just about understanding that we might have various propensities to say yes to things when it's not the best idea. And to get ahead of that, to have a sense of what we have coming up, this can reduce the chances of us impulsively saying yes to something when it was probably not the best idea. Moving forward and sticking to your goals. So actually setting goals, optimizing and that kind of thing. Healthy life, healthy mind, and anger and impulsive mistakes a couple of weeks ago. Emotional resilience from last week, and then just now. All right, so start your Pomodoro engines, guys. What psychology research teaches us about learning? So just as a bit of a prequel to this week, the initial learning phase. So make sure you understand the concepts and integrate information with things that you already knew. The reason why I've got these, is relevant to understanding, why we're doing this review and kind of what to keep in mind while we're doing the review, but it'll be important for anyone who's studying or they have to learn things in work or what have you, just to consider some of these concepts. So in that first acquisition phase, when we're just coming across information in the first time, our brain doesn't have kind of any reason necessarily there to be like, this must be kept for the rest of my life, right? So then if we think about it, there are certain conditions that we can set up to send that idea to our brain more effectively. You remember things to which you associate a strong memory, and particularly if we have to learn labels or something like that don't have a whole lot of meaning in and of themselves, attaching the actual words, attaching the actual ideas with some sort of an emotive reaction can be a very useful way to increase the amount that our brain is going to catalog that information and have it for later, basically. Because if something disgusts us, then that's a sign to us, hey, I ought to remember that really disgusting thing so that I can react to it next time. But we can make use of that when we're remembering labels and stuff like that, including people's names, although there are other methods for kind of all of these things. And that first line of make sure you understand the concepts and integrate the information with things you already know. If you've had experiences like, say, with stuff that we've talked about this week, if you can imagine times where if you had have known this and reacted to some of the information that we went through on the course, that it would have changed what you did, that perhaps there were prior understandings that you had about the way that things worked, and that with these factored in, that those changed in some way. Thinking about how those things will relate as we're learning things, that will allow us to essentially have more pathways through those other things that we know, hey, that's associated with that, I can go to that, to then access that memory at a later date. So building and maintaining access paths, so spaced repetition and active recall. These are two things talking about if we come across information in a given day, why should our brain hold on to that over time, and what we can do to send the idea to our brain that it should do that. So the spaced repetition part, if we are exposed to an idea, some information once, and then we never come across it again, of course, like eventually that's just going to go down and down and down in terms of our ability to access that information when we're doing things or when it relates. If we want that instead to go up, then we want to have these kind of multiple exposures that tells us that it's important over time. But after the first exposure, we're only going to hold on to it for a fairly small amount of time. So the space in spaced repetition starts off fairly small. You have a time that you come across it the first time, perhaps 10 days later or something like that. But after that, you can increase that time. It might go 10 days up to 20 days or a month or something like that, and then so on. And they've actually done research to statistically correlate and figure out what is the optimal time to re-expose ourselves to information to retain it all. There's an app called Anki over on the right. I've got the pro tip. If you're already studying and want to apply these techniques optimally, check out Anki, Anki. The app is free. It's on Mac, Windows, iOS, Android. I believe on iOS is the one platform on which it actually costs some money. I think it's a one-time fee, but on everything else, it's free. It's a tool that will allow you to pull like cue cards in so that you can remember things over time. Now you can take like screenshots and stuff like that to put them in, but you got these cue cards or a question and an answer. And as you go through it, it figures out what the best spaced repetition, the best exposure time frame is for you to be re-exposed to the information. So if you say you're studying for a semester and as you go through, you're putting these cue cards in, you're going to be re-exposed to the things throughout the semester enough that you've got that benefit of spaced repetition without considerably extra time spent just like exposing yourself every day or every week or whatever it is to the same information. So I guess it's a kind of useful shortcut in that sense. And if you've got it on your phone or something like that, it can be used like, just while you're standing in line or something, just scrolling through. You put in there, by the way, you give the feedback, which requires honesty to say whether you got it right or wrong. And that will factor in to the determination of when you get exposed to it next. Now, active recall. So passive recall is like, say, I'm studying for an exam and I've learned some stuff from a textbook and then I pick up the textbook again and I read it. So then I'm passively recalling it because I'm being reminded by something in the environment, right? So the active recall would be me, even if I'm going to go and look it up after, I'm going to figure out like, what is the answer to that question? What's the closest that I can come up with? I'm trying to reach that information. And that's a really important part of the process of continuing to be able to use the information over time, because oftentimes the acquisition phase, like learning in the first place, that went fine, but we won't be able to access it at a later phase because we haven't practiced that active pulling it out, getting that information again. The more that we're intently doing that, the better. So one of the great uses of that is if we kind of use it properly, we're being honest in the sense, we're not just being like, oh, I don't know the answer to that, click through and look at the answer to just passively remind ourselves. But we're at least, if we can't come up with the answer, thinking what it would be, we're trying to pull that out. So we're teaching our brain that it's an important thing to be able to do. So what does it mean for today? So active recall. If you've got notes, don't look at notes before trying to actively recall the answer. So we'll go through and I'll ask questions. It would take too much time to like put your hand up and like give answers to many of these. I'd like you to individually try to come up with the answers for yourself for them as we go, so that you're actively trying to pull up the information. When I ask a question, I like everyone to consider their own response, even jot it down. You don't have to be sure enough or feel comfortable to share it, and you won't have to share it if you don't want to. There'll be points when we have a gap where I might ask if anyone would like to share their questions, but absolutely voluntary. So if you want to jot something down, I invite you to jot down what you think it's most likely to be, even if you're not sure. It's still going to find that active recall, even if you're wrong, because you'll get reminded after. There won't be a problem in that, but you're going through that task of trying to remember it, and that's important. So the first week, understanding ADHD. What is ADHD? Obviously, you can have many different answers. I'd invite you to think, like, after this group, with all the stuff we've talked about, what is ADHD to you? If you were asked that question, what would you say? It doesn't have to be, the textbook answer or anything like that, but after what you've learned about it, it's good to have your own idea of what it is, especially if people might be asking, what's this? What does it mean that you have ADHD? What's hyperfocus? So to remind you kind of going along, we tend to have a lower degree of voluntary self-control. That is to say, to place our intention on things that we're not actually interested in at that moment. Our involuntary control or attention, where we're actually drawn into paying attention to something that we're interested in. that's higher than the average person. So when we're in that situation, when there's something that we're really intently interested in, we will be able to focus compared with the average person for more time, more intently than the average person. And, this can be a real strength. It can lead to getting stuff done potentially really quickly and stuff like that. Of course, it can have downsides as well, especially if maybe you've got to do other things that day. You've got to head out or something like that, and you get really intently caught up into something, and then too much time goes by. There are disadvantages in that way, but that's what's meant by hyperfocus with ADHD. What are some ADHD brain associations? The associations that I'm talking about, I talked about both neurochemical and neurophysiological. So the neurochemical differences relate to dopamine and norepinephrine, where those two excitatory neurotransmitters have less activity on average for people with ADHD. It means related to when we get a spike of that, then we feel an intrinsic sense of reward or achievement, that something is better than expected. And norepinephrine is when we get a spike of that, then the decision that we made or what we're focusing on at that time will remain constant. This allows us to focus on whatever we happen to decide is important at the time, even if we're not interested in it. Now, the physiological associations, so the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this is important for self-control, executive function, things like that, tends to be smaller with less connections for people with ADHD on average. It can be built up, as with the other part of the brain that has an association with ADHD, the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is about when we feel that whatever our response to act is, do this, don't do this, whatever, the impulse to then action is going to take a bit longer. So we get that delay, and that allows other parts of our brain to utilize self-control to figure out what we actually want to do. And this happens when we get a sense that the stakes are high in the situation. Likely delayed and accelerated areas of development. People with ADHD on average have a delay in the development of the prefrontal cortex, kind of from about the temple forward, which relates to some social understanding and things like that, and impulse control. By the time we're in our early 20s, then this is caught up on average. Now, we also have an acceleration or a faster development on average of the motor cortex, the part of our brain that actually corresponds with the action movements of our body. Right, so commanding your attention. What are the situations in which ADHDers find it easier to focus? For some people, it'll be really quiet environments. For others, it'll have some stimulation in the environment, but not something that's going to pull them completely into it. Certainly in situations where we're really interested, or when we have a positive desire to get something done. Like we're focused on, when I get this done, this amazing thing's going to happen that I'm really keen for. That's a good motivation for us. Compared with neurotypical people on average, punishment tends to work less effectively over time for people with ADHD. And that includes the kind of self-punishment of like, I'm going to feel like crap about myself if I don't get this done, or I'm going to really beat myself up, or whatever it is. Now, with everyone in general, it is good to have some mix and to lean our mix toward having more things that we're incentivized for rather than disincentivized to not do, right? But this is more true for people with ADHD. And if we can find the intrinsic reasons that we really want to achieve something, that will be a far better motivator, especially over a long time, than I really don't want to fail for whatever reasons. I'd be embarrassed, or this had happened, or I wouldn't achieve this, or what have you. How to adrenalize your system. Now, of course, there are many answers to this. You could run around the block, right? You could hyperventilate. There are different ways to do it. But the way that we discussed is a Pomodoro technique, where because we have a tendency to get revved up in that scenario, if we're treating it with its full reverence, then that will become an association with doing it. And over time of repeatedly doing it in that way, our system will take all of the signals in the environment, perhaps the sound of the or whatever we set up when we do that, those will become signs that correspond with ramping up and getting more adrenalized, which is good because adrenaline or epinephrine means that we have access to norepinephrine. It's just one more step in the chemical chain that our body creates dopamine, serotonin, by the way, come earlier. Then we get up later to epinephrine, norepinephrine. When we have access to one, we have access to the other. If we get our system adrenalized, then we'll have access to norepinephrine, which means that we can funnel down our focus and get stuff done that we're not too keen on, we're not excited about. How do you use anchors? So I kind of briefly touched on them a little bit in the answer to the last question, where we can have the anchors when we're doing the Pomodoro technique. That could be the auditory anchor of the tick, tick, tick of the egg time if we use that. It could be visual stuff that we set up. There are situations that we have where there are natural anchors to what we're doing, like we're digging a hole, where there's a half-dug hole in front of us. There are triggers in the environment to tell us what we're doing. So if we have a moment of our brain being like, what am I doing again? It's very clear. Not in all things that we do, especially in this modern day, especially on a computer, they can do a whole bunch of different things. Will we have that same setup? There could be a whole bunch of different things that you do on a computer when you need to do some work on it, for example. And if there's work that you don't really want to do, those other things like jumping on YouTube or Netflix or whatever are probably going to be more interesting at that time. To get those anchors out, as in we're shutting down those other programs, so we're not just going to see that and kind of jump into that. And also, and this could be anything if we're going to do it on a regular basis, to have some association with this means I'm getting work done. And the benefit of planning, there are many of them. I think for people with ADHD, when I refer to that, I mean the benefit of looking forward in time and understanding what we actually have coming up. Like if I have something, say I was at university and I have something due in 4 or 5 days, then I might be able to just convince myself, if I don't think about it too much, like, 4 or 5 days is going to take me like a day, no worries. I can goof off and do this and do that, whatever. But what if I've got like 1 day free and then I've got 3 days of just cannot get out of it? I'm going to be really busy. If I realize that, then earlier I would actually get the adrenaline hit of I have to get this done, which would allow me to actually get it done. And that's a really important, useful thing. It can also help us to understand when it's a good idea, not to say yes to things. If we maybe want to do that thing that we've been asked to do or been offered or whatever it is, but legitimately, if we thought about it, we don't have enough time. Pumping the brakes and saying no. So what is the value of low attention rest? I mean, it's important to have rests in between things for everyone, ADHD or not. Particularly for us, I mean, attention is a limited resource. This regulated, like forced attention, voluntary attention like that, it is a limited resource. Think of it like lifting up weights or something like that, or doing something like physically intensive. If you were like building a fence all day, on your lunch break, you're probably not going to go to the gym. And oftentimes we will kind of do the equivalent when it comes to like, I'm forcing myself to do this homework thing. Okay, now I'm going to go out and like do this thing or play a game or whatever it is that actually requires a lot of directed attention as well. And then we never really get a rest there. Allowing ourselves to have times where we're not forcing ourselves to focus on something in between is a really useful thing. What should we consider when deciding what to take on? Well, of course, what do I have coming up? What are the important things? To recognize that difference between what's urgent versus what's important. What seems like it has to be done time sensitively, like it's either now or never kind of thing, being urgent, and what really matters at the end, whether we've done it or not. So like maybe if I get a notification on Facebook or something like that, right? This could be seen as like, well, I guess it's not urgent. I could come back to it later, but it's like, hey, there's a sound there and stuff, whatever. I might be like, I want to look at it now. It could be this thing. But ultimately, doing that versus not doing it at all wouldn't really make any difference. And certainly doing it later, it's fine. It's much the muchness. So it's not truly important in that sense. And there are other things that are important to us to get done, but don't have any kind of crunch time. Like, let's say that you need to do your tax return and maybe you're like a month or two later than you would like to or something like that. And you know that it's got to get done. There's no point where the police come and knock down your door and point the gun at you and say, do your tax return, right? You have to decide, like, I'm getting this done today. So there's no urgency in the sense of like time immediacy to get something done, but it's important. Goal setting principles. So what are SMART goals? If you remember the acronym: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And it's just a way to operationalize something that we want to do. To be like, well, if I can't get to the end of some time point and have a clear point where I'm like, have I done this or not? Have I achieved this or not? I don't have any chance to reward myself or to see my progress over time. And particularly if I tend to beat myself up or dismiss kind of stuff that I have achieved, then I might just be like, that was just nothing though. We've got to really be specific enough that we know that what we've got to do. We know when we've got to do it. So we've actually set it down to a certain time and stuff. We've kind of figured out that that is an ideal time that would work with the other things that we've got on. And it allows that check-in point so that we can keep on getting spurred on and keep on going for it. Take the vague goal and do more exercise and make it SMART. So it can be like, hey, I'd really like to get up to this point. The longer I do it, the more habitual it'll be. And therefore it'll be easier to keep on going. But I tend to set the amount of time before we review on like, how confident are you? If I'm like really confident I'm going to get something done, then it might be a longer space of time. I'd need like less kind of reinforcement. But if I was like really unconfident that I'm going to be able to sustain it at all, then I want to have close check-in points. So then we can think like, have I planned anything for that time? Is something else going to come up? Sometimes we'll plan something and it might be like, maybe it's some work I want to do at home and it'll be for a time that I'm like, I knew I was going to be in another town, right? And it's like, well, that wasn't going to work that time, right? Maintaining your goals. So what is the best mindset with which to review your goals? The curious mind approach, because it's so easy to look down on ourselves, even if we, under the same conditions, might not look down on someone else. We want to kind of minimize any propensity that we would have to do that. And if we can get into like basically step out of our normal position of being like, if I haven't done that, that means something bad about me, to being like, here's something that I'm trying out, something that I'm experimenting with that I've set up over this time. Now I'm going to look back on it. I'm going to kind of step back into those shoes as like, this was an experiment. How did it go? Because if we can have that approach, then it takes away from that notion of like, I should have done better or whatever. And those notions do not make us do better in the long run. They just make it more likely often that we'll give up. So state any SMART goal and list a few expected barriers if you were to self-apply it. So we talked about a couple in that last slide of like, maybe you plan something for a time when you're not able to do it. I guess it's like there are several points to get in on it, where could be, I kind of had the idea of the goal, but I didn't set a reminder. And then I just totally forgot about it. I might have had every intention to do with it. I might have been so motivated that if I had remembered or had the reminder that I'd do it, right? So I don't want to like beat myself up and be like, I failed at the thing I tried to do when I didn't try to do it. So that would be an early point. And then there are different points along the way. It could be like, yes, I remembered, but I set an alarm, but then I dismissed it straight away because I was busy and I didn't reset it on the time. So it's like, okay, so I should do something then. There are a whole bunch of different things that we can plan that we can look back and be like, all right, so what if I didn't achieve exactly what I wanted to? What were the things, like the situational things that I could change about the way that I'm framing the goal for myself to reasonably figure out, in the same way as we might if we were an experimenter or we were thinking about someone else and we had set up conditions and our hypothesis wasn't exactly adhered to. Then we would think through, was it not adhered to because they didn't get it or they thought this or they, didn't try it or whatever. There are a whole bunch of different reasons. The clearer we can be about thinking about this, the more we get into problem solving mode and can actually be effective. How do you build multiple habits? And the main thing there is what not to do, which is don't try to set up multiple habits all at once. we will have a tendency to want to get things done all at once, or to, pile on another goal when we've just been adhering to one for a little bit. We generally want to pull back on it. If we can make something into a habit, retain it for such a time that it becomes habitual for us and we don't have to think as much about actually making sure that it happens, that's the point where we can comfortably then do something else, stack something else on it, where that becomes the goal, because then we just have that habitual thing that we don't have to think about too much. So then we're not like trying to learn how to ride a bike at the same time as learning how to ride it with no hands. You learn how to ride a bike until the point that you don't really have to think about riding a bike anymore, generally. And then you take your hands off the bars and see how it goes. Aspects of a healthy lifestyle. So how does exercise help the ADHD brain? So I talked about a couple of different things. One was that it will upregulate dopamine and norepinephrine, those two neurotransmitters that I talked about that tend to be underregulated for people with ADHD. It also upregulates serotonin, which can be beneficial for mood and stuff like that. And that if we've done 30 minutes of high intensity cardio exercise, we tend to have a 2-hour window after that where we have upregulated dopamine and norepinephrine to the extent that there isn't a significant difference between us and the average person. So like to get stuff done that we might otherwise find difficult or what have you, sometimes it can be a really good idea to get some exercise in the morning, particularly the high intensity variety, but any is better than none. What diet did we discuss for ADHD and why? So the specific diet that we discussed was the keto diet, which is about drastically limiting the amount of carbohydrates that we have in our diet. We primarily have our energy sources fat, and obviously to have protein there as well. But the reason why they talk about that for ADHD is that when we have high glycemic index, so high GI carbohydrates in particular, that'll spike our blood sugar, the sugars, the starches, the grains and stuff. And this is the case for everyone, not just people with ADHD, but we'll get this kind of like, we feel like we've got all the energy in the world and then insulin hits and that's all or nothing. And then we feel like we've just crashed and might be grumpy and stuff, might crave something else. During those times, we're more likely to be kind of more erratic and stuff. Now, the alternative in getting less of our energy from carbohydrates would lead instead to have a more consistent energy throughout the day and to have less extremes of times when we're not at our best. So what are some principles for getting your sleep in order? I mean, if you're having trouble in getting to sleep, it's very common for people with ADHD to have more trouble in getting to sleep and potentially to maybe have that as our hyper-focus time where we're kind of getting into things and stuff like that and staying up later than we want to. In that case, it can be about making the compromise, figuring out how to have stressful eating time elsewhere. It can be having a novelty cutoff, as in like, I don't have to force myself to go into bed when I'm not tired, but I won't have anything more novel after a certain time to kind of wind down from that so that if we get that kind of sleepy wave that comes periodically, then we can actually catch it instead of, watching or reading something else and then I'm not sleepy. But yeah, lots of answers to that question. Aspects of a healthy lifestyle. So what benefits does mindfulness meditation give those who practice it? So because it's the act of intentionally like keeping your attention on some subject, and it doesn't matter, like it's an arbitrary subject, can be our breath, can be point out our forehead, can be a mantra, anything. But as long as we have some subject that whenever we realize that we've started paying attention to other stuff, that we circle it back to it, this is sustaining our attention voluntarily on something. And we're practicing that resource limited part of our brain, part of our mind, and that will help with situations where we need to use it. The model for self-control is called the strength model for that kind of reason, where we build up strength in the same way. It's a limited resource. If I were to lift up a weight that I can lift, but then I lift it enough times, I'm not going to be able to lift it again. And if I were to do that, or like to lift up a heavy weight every day, or, several times a week or whatever, then eventually my system's going to reorient such that it's giving more energy, more resources to my capacity to lift that weight. Same goes with our self-control. So what are automatic thoughts and what influences what yours are at any given moment? So these are just the kind of thoughts that pop into our mind in a given situation. And, sometimes they can be really credible, useful ideas, but they're highly moderated by our mood, by how we're feeling at that time, by recent things that has just happened, and by the state of our resources. If we're feeling grumpy, if we're feeling stressed and stuff like that. They should be seen as, sure, they're ideas that have popped into mind. They don't have to be our ideas and that we're identifying with them and, putting everything into them. And we can question them. And that's a really useful thing to realize. What influences yours at the moment? So this is the mood and all those sorts of things. What are you in mindfulness meditation theory, and over what do you have control? By that, I mean, when we're talking about mindfulness meditation, the you is your mind's eye. So rather than to think of ourselves as I'm this person in this body and I have these thoughts that pop around my mind and they mean something about me and all that kind of stuff, we're simplifying and saying we are our mind's eye. We are the observer. Thoughts can be considered like objects that pass by the mind's eye, and they have a certain amount of time before they will discontinue, and all thoughts will discontinue after a certain amount of time, regardless of how much attention we pay to them. If we pay high attention or have a high emotional reaction to the thoughts, then that will increase the rate that they repeat on us, that we have the thought over again. And there's no such thing as, by the way, anti-attending to a thought, to push it away, being like, I don't want to think about this. That stresses me out. That just means the stressing out, high emotional reaction, and I'm paying attention to it to try to push it away. It is the subject. Impulsiveness. How do you maximize brain baseline performance? So these are the things that we've kind of talked a bit about today a bit. So exercise, but regularly. A diet that doesn't have really high GI carbohydrates is generally balanced and stuff like that. Good sleep, all sorts of things like that. How do you train your impulse control? So mindfulness meditation is one way, but in general, impulse control, which is to say self-control, pulling ourselves back when we have a desire to do something at that moment or an impulse to do something, but we don't want to have done it. Because it's a use it or lose it situation, we train it by using it, delaying gratification, not allowing ourselves just to have any given thing that we crave, doing things that are hard that we know are good for us, which might be like going for a run or something like that. Using self-control is train self-control. Anger. What is the primal purpose of anger? So I talked about it regarding unfairness and assertiveness and described a mock situation in which somebody was being kind of bullied and perhaps lightly bullied, but like continuous isn't going to stop if they don't change it. There are situations where it's useful to stand up and to say something. And anger is the emotion we feel when we recognize that. Sometimes we're wrong, and sometimes anger will be like an overlay kind of feeling that we have on top of other things like vulnerability or something like that are more difficult to sit with. But it's around assertiveness, standing up for ourselves, making sure that we're not being wronged or sidelined. Yeah. Reflect on how the following cause anger with an example. So feeling that we are unable to take responsibility for frustrating things in the moment. So that wouldn't be a situation when we have like genuine anger, where something is genuinely unfair and we should do something about it because we're not being wronged. We're doing something imperfectly, right? But for various reasons, we might not want to take that on, or like taking it on feels so frustrating because it doesn't get us anywhere, where, we don't magically have the answer because we realize that we're the ones who don't have the answer. But this is the overlay on vulnerability. wanting to win an argument, wanting to get back at people for upsetting us. So this might be a situation in which we've kind of felt like we were wronged or what have you, but if we reflected on it rationally, it wouldn't lead to a necessary response. But if we're feeling angry, there will be certain things that we change in our body language, in our voice, louder, deeper, closer standing, bigger, maybe slam doors, move quickly, stuff like that. All of these things are sending a message to the person that we're in an argument with, and we're generally aware of what that impact is, even if we kind of tell ourselves that that's not part of the reason why we're doing it. A deeper look at emotional drives. What may result from repeated perceived experience of failure? Like if we've experienced situations where we've felt that other people have looked down on us for our lack of achievement, lack of capability or what have you, what might we do? So that might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't try things because we believe we're going to fail, or we think that would be really bad if we did, or we try things or like we throw ourselves into things, but because we think we're inevitably going to fail, we don't do everything we could to do as well as we could. And of course we don't. But we do that kind of hoping that it won't be as much of a sting by the end of it when we inevitably fail in our mind, but it still hits home and we don't get to see what we could have achieved otherwise. How might people compensate if they don't think you're good enough? Now, good enough, it's like, well, good enough for what? Incomplete predicate. But in this sense, it's good enough to be useful, to be charming, to have around, whatever. But it's a sense of like, to be enough, to be accepted, to be valued by others. We might compensate with people pleasing, or we might compensate by really leaning into some area that we feel that we have been recognized in or seen in, to the point that we're trying to like maximize that, hoping that if we achieve some, chasing a rainbow impossible state of that, then we will feel that it's enough. None of those things, of course, work out, but there are various things that we might do. How do you stop people pleasing? Well, I mean, behind people pleasing tends to lie a fear that that's the reason why people stick around, because we haven't tested out to see whether they would without it. So in the first place, it's getting to the point where we can start testing out our theory that people pleasing isn't actually a requirement, that we will still be valued without it. And so that means taking what we feel are risks and to see how that goes and to lean into that. And over time, it'll get easier and to feel less against the grain, and we will be less stressed and our self-esteem won't be as low. How do you adjust unrelenting standards, which can be thought of as like perfectionism and stuff like that? So I describe the way of like aiming for 95% of our usual standards. Like if unrelenting standards are leading to spending a ridiculous amount of time on things before we submit them, that can be a really good move. If unrelenting standards is maybe leading to like real stress of the possibility of failing to the point that it actually inhibits our ability to do well, then it's in finding ways to improve our confidence and to look at like, what are things that I'm doing that I feel that I must do, that maybe I'm only achieving because I have done. Again, it comes down to experiments, proving stuff to ourselves, because these ideas about I'm not good enough or I'm a failure or what have you, these are core belief type, like foundational ideas that we have that form our view of ourselves, the world, and others. Experience is what we aim for in order to correct our notion of these. Just a theoretical understanding won't be enough. So deeper look at emotional drives continued. So what are two styles of attachment that result from believing people will bend in them? I mean, both the insecure and the styles of attachment come from believing that people will abandon us, but under different circumstances. So the anxious ambivalent style being if we kind of have that intermittent connection, so they're there sometimes, not there other times, and then we can get really upset about the possibility that we're being rejected, even if we're not, and potentially jump in to reject them first. The anxious avoidant would be if it's more continuous, that we have to kind of take care of ourselves and we believe that that is the status quo and we must always be capable of doing it. relying on somebody else in a relationship over time feels like a vulnerability. And in that sense, if we couldn't trust that we could rely on somebody continually being there in that way, then it would be a vulnerability to become reliant on somebody in that way. It often relies on somebody still wanting to be self-resilient, to no matter what happens, no matter how close they might be in a relationship with somebody else, it's still that they must be able to stand strong on their own 2 feet.